Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to thank the IHPPA for inviting me to give this talk. It's an enormous honor to speak here today. Now, I'm going to talk about challenges in evaluating surgical innovation. I have one disclosure, which I'm not going to talk about today. So when we talk about surgical innovation, this is really nothing to do with developing a device or anything like that. This is pure surgical innovation that we do all the time in the operating room. I think surgeons are naturally innovators because we are always sort of tweaking what we do. We might try a new incision, we might change the way we do an anastomosis, but it's trying to determine what are significant surgical innovation therapies versus just a change in variation in what we do. So what are the challenges in evaluating surgical innovation? First of all, a really robust definition is lacking. Second of all, we need to ensure that patients are properly protected and that they have autonomy when we're going through surgical innovations. Another challenge is to assess and evaluate the innovation, to establish oversight, to fund the assessment and oversight, and we need to be able to do this all without stifling innovation. Now, there are a few background questions that we need to ask before we get into some of the challenges. Where does the term innovative therapy come from? Is surgical innovation research? How do innovation operations and innovative devices used in operations differ? Is all departure from accepted practice innovative therapy? What's a surgical modification that can be introduced without formal evaluation? And what's a significant innovation that needs proof of safety before wide adoption? And how do we determine and assure safety and efficacy with innovative therapies? So where does the term surgical innovation therapy come from? The National Commission for Protection of Human Subjects of Medical and Behavioral Research was established in 1974 in the US. The Belmont Report came out of this, and it summarizes ethical principles and guidelines for research involving human subjects and identified 3 fundamental ethical principles for the protection of human subjects of research: autonomy, beneficence, and justice. The Belmont Report also defined physician activity. Practice of medicine are those activities intended solely to enhance the well-being of the individual patient with a reasonable expectation of success, and research is a class of activity designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. Based on the Belmont Report, regulations were issued by the federal government to protect human subjects of research. These regulations are binding on institutions that undertake federally funded research involving humans. So where does the term surgical innovative therapy come from? Innovative therapy, or it could be, in other words, practice, innovative clinical practice, is characterized by being both novel and non-validated. Innovative therapies combine aspects of practice directed towards the treatment of an individual patient and research, which is an undefined risk related to novelty and the possibility of developing generalizable knowledge. Are surgical innovative therapies research? According to the Belmont Report, they are not research, unless they are formally structured as a research project, for example, a randomized controlled trial. But it also said that significant innovations in therapy of patients should be incorporated in a research project, while in order to establish their safety and efficacy, while retaining the therapeutic objective in the individual patient. So here the key is significant. The Belmont Report said that innovative therapies were not research, but that significant innovations should be evaluated like research, while not restricting its use in individual patients. Terms were not defined, and recommendation was never incorporated into a federal regulation, and hence we really don't have a good framework for assessment for innovative therapies. In addition to the Belmont Report, there was also the Declaration of Helsinki, which similarly recognized the role of research in the advancement of medical care, and the emphasis on the well-being of the patient is that the patient is the main concern. However, where proven therapeutic methods do not exist or have been ineffective, the physician, with informed consent from the patient, must be free to use unproven new therapeutic measures. So again, giving the option of surgical innovation without governance or oversight, but obviously with full and clear consent being an ethical obligation and patient protection and autonomy through all stages. How do innovation operations and innovative devices used in operations differ? Well, in the United States, we have the FDA, which regulates products. The FDA's mission is to promote and protect the public health by helping safe and effective medical products reach the market in a timely way and monitoring these products for continued safety after they are in use. An operation is not a product, and an introduction of new operations is not regulated by the FDA. Approval of medical technology by the FDA requires safety and efficacy of a device to be shown by either demonstration that the device is substantially similar to an approved device, this is a lower level, and a more formal evaluation process for a new device. There are two levels of assessment. The lower level deals with the immediate proximate effects of the device, for example, radiofrequency ablation. Does the device actually ablate the tumor? So this is biological effectiveness. Versus higher levels deal with broader and ultimately more important issues. Does the ablation extend life or save lives, or what is the cost effectiveness? And this is the clinical effectiveness. We have two levels of effectiveness needed for approval. Level 1, the demonstration that the device is similar to an approved device, this is biological, and a formal evaluation process, biological effectiveness and clinical effectiveness are required. So this is a higher level of approval. Now, is all departure from accepted practice an innovative therapy? What is a significant innovation? And how do we determine safety and efficacy of innovative therapies? Again, the Belmont report suggested that significant innovations in therapy should be incorporated in a research project in order to establish their safety and efficacy while retaining the therapeutic objectives in the individual patient. And because this was not incorporated into with any federal oversight, there really is no formal assessment of what we do with surgical innovation therapies. So back to the challenges that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. First of all, to define what is a significant surgical innovation. So significant innovations are characterized by the need for recredentialing, the extent to which novelty is claimed, risk to third parties. The reason why the definitions are lacking is because these terms of significant difference and major variation lack specification. In addition, surgeons tend to disagree about what is innovation and what's not. New interventions are not always seen as innovation, and an innovation may increase the burden or regulation of oversight, and therefore surgeons may not want to call their intervention an innovation. This results, however, in potential significant risk, not only for the patient, but also for the surgeon and for the hospital. Suggestions defining a surgical innovation as significant are things like an innovation that requires retraining or recredentialing, for an example, using the robot for minimally invasive surgery. An innovation that provides diagnosis or treatment for a condition for which none previously existed, for example, liver transplant. An innovation directed towards improving the health of a sick individual that would also place a healthy individual at risk, for example, living donation. Deployment of existing devices in different ways, for example, using the laparoscope or the robot to do a Whipple procedure. New surgical technique for a standard procedure, when we change from a veno-venous bypass for liver transplant to piggyback technique. And new indications for an established technique, for example, how we expand the use of liver transplant for different kinds of cancers, for example, cholangio, and for potentially colorectal mets. Now, in an effort to be clearer about surgical innovation, Hutchinson and her group tried to define better surgical innovation. They came up with criteria to look at surgical procedures, whether or not surgical procedures are innovative or whether they're variations. And so they went through criteria including an innovative technique, which is a technique used new or differs from the standard technique in the following ways. It's altogether new, so it's a completely new operation like the liver transplant. It's new to the anatomical location, so a novel anatomical approach for an existing procedure. or new to the patient group. So you might have changed from adults to children. And then an innovative device, the tools or devices used are new, or the use differs from the standard use. And so this would be, for example, doing a laparoscopic liver resection that hadn't been done before, new to anatomical location and new to patient group. They also addressed a bunch of questions to try to determine what's innovation and what's routine variation. For example, do you think a surgical journal will be interested in publishing your innovation as a case study? But instead of having to go through all of these questions, they came up with a surgical innovation identification tool. And this is basically two questions: the techniques, instruments, and/or devices to be used in the operation for which the patient has consented. Have all been used in this hospital? Yes, no. Have all been used by the surgeon? Yes, no. And no response for either of these items identifies the first performance of the intervention by the surgeon or introduction of the intervention to the hospital. And this may flag an innovation. Second of all, the second question, the conditions under which this operation will take place do not depart from those under which such a procedure would usually occur. For example, the techniques, instruments, and/or devices to be used in the operation for which the patient has consented are routinely used. A, for this indication. Yes, no. For patients of this sex, age, and comorbidity. And if a no is checked for any of these, then that may flag an innovation. I think if you think about an example, say, using the microwave ablation for the first time. It's the first time you're using it. You know, what have you said to the patient beforehand? This is an approved device, but it's the first time you're using it in the hospital. And I think these are important questions that are, in theory, very easy to and clear to answer, but in reality are really quite challenging. So why do we need surgical evaluation or evaluation of surgical innovation? So this is a terrible, tragic example of in 2006 in the UK, where two surgeons used an approved device, a morcellator at the time of splenectomy. The patient died, and the inquest, the aorta was lacerated. And so the hospital determined that the device was a new surgical technique, and as such should have included a mechanism for consent and oversight. But again, no standard pathways exist. So, challenge number 2, to ensure patient protection and autonomy. Of course, the patient needs to be informed of anything that we think is off track or a variation to what we normally do. Even though the procedure is intended to benefit the patient and is not research, the procedure is different than the standard procedures that is this innovation. It may contain unknown risk and undefined efficacy. The patient also needs to be told of the risks that are known, and the consent should include other features of autonomous consent as is currently done for research, i.e. alternatives and assurances, and the other things that we go through with consent. So for the remaining slides will really deal with these other 4 challenges that I feel we come across when we're evaluating surgical innovation therapies. So this is a graph of the diffusion of innovation. And when we look at this bell curve, over here we have the innovators and the early adopters. Now, you have to kind of look at the graph and you sort of figure out who you are and where you lie on this graph. We need innovators and we need early adopters because they're the people who are going to bring new techniques to the forefront. However, without really good outcomes, efficacy, and technique reporting, we will never get the late majority to come on board, because the people who are over on this side of the graph need to see 50, 100 cases before they will believe that the new innovation is worth doing. And it's using this graph that a framework for assessment of surgical innovation was really developed. And this was developed through the Balliol collaboration in the UK, but it involved surgeons from many different areas, including Steve Strasberg, Jeffrey Burke, and Peter McCullough, and many others who wrote 3 really excellent papers in the Lancet on surgical innovation and evaluation. Now, this ideal group have since met several times and updated their information, but I will give you this table from the original paper. And so basically they talk about the ideal being the idea, which is the proof of concept, development of the idea, the D. 2B is exploration, learning a little bit more about it. 3 is assessment, and 4 then is long-term study. When we think about reporting during the different stages of assessment, if we go to stage 1, development, which is really going to be the innovators and maybe some early adopters, currently there's variable hospital reporting. Ideally, we should have an anonymous reporting system where you could report what you were doing, the innovation, and potential adverse outcomes, somewhat similar to how aviation is reported. Stage 2A, exploration. So currently, it's usually retrospective case series reports. It would be really nice at this stage to develop protocols for prospective studies beyond the institution, because generally speaking, you have some early adopters in this stage. Stage 2B, where you have increasing adoption, would be the time to consider prospective data collection, prospective randomized trials, or uncontrolled trials, likely again between institutions. We need to define the relevant outcome measures at this stage, technical, clinical, and very important to have patient-reported outcomes as well. In stage 3, which is the assessment phase, effectiveness versus current standards are assessed at this point. So we're really looking at the new treatment versus the old treatment. A randomized controlled trial is ideal, but again, often not feasible. And finally, we reach stage 4, which is long-term assessment. This is ideal for registries or for large cohorts to be examined and to look at some of the results. Particularly, looking at large cohorts can find small but risky complications. For example, in laparoscopic cholecystectomy, the increased incidence of bile duct injury was only discovered after the report from a large registry from New York. So randomized control, so how do we look at reporting? How do we do the evaluations? Randomized control trials, of course, are the gold standard for safety and efficacy of an intervention. What are the challenges with randomized control trials? There are several. First of all, cost and funding. Second of all, when should the trial be done? If the trial is done too early, the constraints of the randomized control trial could obstruct innovation. The technique may not be fully developed or refined, and the study may actually represent the learning curve of the technology or of the innovation, not the final therapeutic effect intervention. If the study is done too late, equipoise could be lost. Lack of enrollment is another challenge. The surgeon, and then perhaps the patient, can be biased towards one type or another. There's fear of litigation. Patients like to make their own decisions, so they dislike randomization. Large numbers are often required to find a small risk complication. So you may need huge numbers to do a randomized control trial effectively when you're looking for a small complication to have the right power. Surgeon expertise is another potential problem. You can do expertise based design, but the surgeon preferences can also confound the results. Other types of trial that are suggested, a tracker trial has been suggested, which incorporates an incremental stepwise innovation using assessment of a surgical procedure. In this design proposal, modifications of the technique can actually occur during the trial. They're recorded and tracked then in the statistical analysis. While this is conceptually very attractive, it would be very challenging to carry out in practice. Non-randomized studies. So most advances in surgical knowledge, as we know, are from these. Now, of course, the level of evidence is far inferior to a randomized controlled trial, but they are useful. There's observational studies can be useful, especially with large cohorts. Multi-center collaborations when we're dealing with small numbers of innovative operations being performed. Case series and case reports, while they're low level of evidence, often are the portal to report early new techniques and exploratory cases. The ideal are protocol-driven studies that account for all patients and have accurate and informative clinical data. Better data collection results in less gaps and can protect against biases. Challenges in non-randomized studies, most are retrospective and are variable quality. For innovation, the learning curve is still a problem for the outcomes. Accounting for pre-treatment differences can be challenging. Statistical methods can try to overcome some of the confounding effects, but this is also difficult. And causal inferences established in non-randomized trials have to always be considered with a little caution, because there are several that have been later proved wrong after randomized control trial has been performed. One of the other major problems in looking at surgical innovation versus, say, for example, trialing a drug, is that there are a huge number of forces at play in the operating room and in the perioperative care of the patient. This can result in widespread variation of any one technique on any one patient. We look at this graph here. This is, I'm sorry, I don't have the reference. This is from Steve Strasberg's paper, the first one on surgical innovation in that same Lancet, 2009. But you can see we have post-op care, ICU, the operating room, the anesthesia team, so multiple forces at play that can cause problems. Surgical skill and surgical experience also result in differences. Finally, if we try to standardize everything too much, we can definitely limit participation. Registries are an alternative, or can also be used in conjunction with trials that are ongoing. Rigorous registries are clearly vital for the transparent, long-term study of all new innovations. Some authors suggest that almost all surgical patients should be entered into registries. There are several major national all-inclusive registries that provide high-quality feedback to surgeons on their own outcomes and have a proven role in facilitating the improvement they suggest. Some countries have great national databases. It's a little more challenging for the bigger countries to do this, and this is perhaps where our societies can definitely come into play and play a role in the registries. Of course, there are challenges with registries. They're not ideal either. There are limitations with design, similar to any observational method in evidence development. Of course, there's voluntary participation. This is time-consuming. People don't necessarily have the resources to do it. It's difficult to ensure the data quality and validity. It's all about outcome reporting, so you need incentive. You want to present your bad data as well as your good data. Of course, there's always money. Funding and management of the registry is costly. They do, however, show potential to drive quality improvement. They do show potential to detect complications, and they do allow for real-time product evaluation. One example of the registry, an international registry, is the ALPS registry, which is ideal for this procedure, which is being performed in multiple locations, but probably not in big numbers compared to some of the other surgeries we perform, and the results are periodically presented. Now, what's the role of societies? Well, the American College Oncology Surgical Group published a randomized control trial. This is the updated results, looking at rectal cancer, laparoscopic versus open. And this was back when there was lots of controversy about whether or not the laparoscopic rectal resection was a good idea and was a good idea for cancer. And so this was done through a society, which I think is really probably the key to everything, particularly when we're looking at such an international group and area of specialization. We need to use our societies to be able to collaborate. We at the AHPPA in the Americas have the Clinical Trials Committee that was started a couple of years ago, and we are trying to, and have one randomized control trial up and running, and trying to develop more through that group to help with collaboration. Another registry that is associated with the AHPPA is the IRE registry, and this is actually funded partially by industry. And while the AHPPA and a mixture of angioDynamics manage the registry, the data is entered into a third-party database. It still calls for voluntary entry of the data, but again, it's a great portal for trying to monitor what is going on with IRE. Now, I'm not suggesting that a consensus conference is the way that we have to assess surgical innovation, because obviously we have to have a number of the procedures done before a consensus conference can happen. But I'm going to use the example of this minimally invasive pancreatic resection conference, consensus conference that happened in 2016. And here, Dr. Barkin used the ideal framework to propose a window of opportunity between exploration and assessment to consider performing a randomized controlled trial. So they actually use that framework to try to position where minimally invasive pancreatic resection is at the moment. There was discussions from Steve Strasberg about how observational studies are useful, how randomized controlled trials can be challenging, and the whole consensus conference was not so much about the technique of pancreatic resection, it was much more about how to manage the innovation and how to assess it and how to follow it. And they came up with, using the ideal framework, that minimally invasive pancreatic resection is in phase 2A was one of their conclusions from the conference. So just showing how the framework can be used in a consensus conference setting to try to assess surgical innovations. What kind of existing oversight do we have at the moment? Well, in the US and in many other countries, there are bodies like the FDA, in Australia, the TGA, but this is only for devices. This does not govern surgical innovation in the operating room. And at the institutional level, there is variable oversight. There's no institutional collaborations, however. You have varying hospital committees looking at patient safety and quality, credentialing and privileging, and morbidity and mortality conferences. But again, it's very ad hoc and it's not standardized. All reporting requires identification of the surgical innovation. So who should do this? Should it be the surgeon, the division chief? Should there be group discussions about what should be defined and reported? There's always potential for reluctance too, because if there are stringent oversights, surgeons may not want to go through the burden of that and may avoid reporting. And then the question is, what other levels of oversight can be attained? In transplant, we're very used to regulation. And we have, UNOS generally performs routine site visits every 3 years for multi-organ transplant programs to ensure accuracy and compliance. You can see in this box here, this list of 9 requirements that transplant programs must obey. In addition, they must achieve minimum expected outcomes. Programs with observed graft failures or patient deaths exceeding variable observed over expected ratios and observed minus expected ratios will, if they do not meet the standards, they will result in an investigation and a potential shutdown or suspension of their program. Now, as a result, there is risk management and risk-averse behavior. And in Northwestern, the statisticians and some of the transplant physicians came up with a great program called RAPID. This is something that many of the programs in the US currently use to assess their risk ahead of time. And so this is just an example. So we have in the highlighted area, the cohort runs over a 2.5-year period. We look at, this is liver, graft survival, and patient survival. Over here, we have our O minus E, O versus O over E, and the one-sided p-value. If you flag in 3 criteria in CMS, you will be investigated, and if you flag in 1 of the criteria in MPSC, you'll be flagged. And you can look ahead in these other groups ahead in time to see where you lay in your risk strategy. Finally, the assessment of surgical innovation. When we look at transplant policies, there is a huge amount of requirement if you want to, say, introduce a living donor program. This is a 20-page document of all the requirements that you have to have in place in order to do it. So while this is great oversight, we're always watching our results in transplant, and we need oversight for sure, but we have to do it without stifling innovation. So to summarize, I think we need clear definitions of surgical innovation versus variation. We do need to get early reporting and early outcomes. Patient protection and autonomy is essential. Using frameworks like IDEAL are very helpful to classify the stage of evolution of an innovation. and study design and reporting methods must be optimized. I really believe we need to own this space, and we need to use our societal connections and collaborations to be able to create the registries and do the randomized controlled trials that we need to do to assess these innovations. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this bright overview of this difficult topic, I think. Are there some burning questions important? Okay, if not, so then we close the session. Thank you very much, Majella. We go on with the next topic.